Welcome to another edition of Bigger Than Sports. I'm your host, Chris Williamson, and joining me for this week's episode is two-time Super Bowl champ, Hall of Fame coach, Tony Dungy. Coach, thanks so much for joining us, first off.
Hey, Chris, thank you for having me. I'm looking forward to it.
Let's go back to your childhood now. What was it like growing up in Jackson, Michigan, in an area that was predominantly white?
You have to remember the time frame. I was born in 1955, so I'm growing up in the 60s. I'm in high school in the 70s, very turbulent time. Jackson is a small automotive community. The city itself is maybe 30% African-American, but we ended up living in a predominantly African-American community, getting bused to white middle school, white high school. And it was not, I don't want to say a culture shock, but certainly different for me, learning two different ways of living and kind of existing at my community center and in the neighborhood, and then going to a predominantly white high school.
And going off of that, I guess, when did you realize you were treated differently, as a Black person? When was that moment?
My parents really did a great job of teaching us to accept everybody for who they are and be friends with everyone and not look at yourself in a certain category. So I was taught that way from very young. And you realize that there's different rules for Black and different rules for white. But I was really blessed. I had a lot of friends, teammates, Black and white. I had a lot of guys that I hung out with. So I understood that I was different, that being African-American was different, but it never seemed like a handicap to me. Now, my dad came through that system, and he was a high school senior in 1944 and wanted to enlist in the service, and the service was still segregated. And he came out of the University of Michigan after the service, got his degree in education in 1952 and couldn't teach in certain schools, could only teach in segregated schools. So my dad kind of grew up with, hey, it is different, it is separate. He tried to teach us not to let that impact us, that the world was going to be different.
As far as your playing career, you went on to play at the University of Minnesota, where at the end of your time, Coach, you held nearly every major passing record for the university. So I'm sure you expected to be drafted in the NFL as a QB. Why was that not the case for you and so many other Black quarterbacks at the time?
I ended up going to the University of Minnesota because they had a history of playing Black quarterbacks, and I wanted to keep that tradition going. But I go on, I don't get drafted, and they tell me, well, my skill set isn't set for the NFL. So I have a chance to go to Canada and play quarterback like so many African-American quarterbacks at that time, or I could go to the NFL and switch positions. So I decided, hey, I want to play with the best. I'll switch positions. I ended up going to Pittsburgh and becoming a safety. The next year, Warren Moon comes out. He's the most valuable player in the Pac-10. He's the most valuable player of the Rose Bowl, which they win, and he doesn't get drafted. They tell him his skill set is not what the NFL is looking for. Warren didn't want to change positions. He goes to Canada, wins 5 Grey Cups in 6 years, and then comes back. But that's the kind of the times that we were living in. And now we see Deshaun Watson and Russell Wilson and Lamar Jackson. Well, we had those kind of guys, but they didn't get the opportunity back then.
Right. And so it's good to see that type of progress. And moving on to your coaching career, in 8 of your first 10 seasons as an assistant in the NFL, you stated you were the only Black person on the staff. So how isolated did you feel in that environment?
It was crazy. We didn't think too much of it at the time. When I came into the National Football League, there were 28 teams. There were 10 African-American assistant coaches in the whole league. 10 teams had 1 coach on their staff, minority. 18 teams had 0. When I got into coaching and I went on the staff, now all of a sudden you start doing things not with the players, but with the coaches. So my family and my wife had to adjust. Now we're hanging out with the coaches, and it's an all-white environment. And that's the first time that the shock kind of hit me, because who does my wife hang out with? Who does she have to relate to? And what does my family have to look forward to? When I started moving up the ladder, my next job was at Minnesota with Denny Green, and Denny Green was very intentional about that. So I get to Denny's staff, and it's Tyrone Willingham and Willie Shaw and Richard Solomon, and we've got Jeff Robinson, all these African Americans running around the building, and I was like in shock. I'd never seen that before. And so I thought at that point, yeah, that's, if I ever become a head coach, I need to be intentional, just like Denny was.
And on that staff, you helped engineer, the #1 ranked defense with the Vikings, but you didn't even get a phone call, for any of the head coaching jobs, Coach. So how did you not give up at that point? Because it'd be very easy and understandable to just sit back and understand, okay, maybe I'll just be an assistant coach, for the rest of my coaching career.
That was the one time in my whole career I really was discouraged to a certain point. 1993, we're in the playoffs. We got the #1 defense in football, and there's 5 or 6 job openings that year. And I didn't get one phone call, no interview, no one even asking if I had interest. And I thought, boy, how often is this going to happen? How often are you going to have the #1 defense and have this many openings? And maybe it's not going to happen. And of course, Denny was just so encouraging. And he said, just wait and be patient. The right opportunity will come.
And that opportunity ended up being, with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. And Coach, you end up transforming the culture from them being a laughingstock after having 14 straight losing seasons to taking to the playoffs, most of your time there. Did you feel like you were held to a higher standard as a Black coach, especially given the fact that, you're making the playoffs so often, and then you get fired, and then John Gruden takes them to the Super Bowl and wins it all?
Now, what I really thought, and I did what I'd hoped to do. When I interviewed at Tampa, they had had nothing but losing for over a decade, as you mentioned. And, hey, we've got to get back to respectability. And I said, hey, I will bring you a winner. Now, it's not going to be the most important thing in my life. We're going to do things. We're going to be community-minded. We're going to have good role models, the right type of people. But we are going to win. And so it took a year to kind of get it going. But then we started winning. We get to the NFC Championship game, and we're in the playoffs consistently, but we're now kind of spoiled. Okay, yeah, we're a playoff team. All those 10 lost seasons and 12 lost seasons, that's gone. But hey, we can't get over the top. So our ownership, they made a decision that they wanted to go in another direction. And it was hurtful because I did just what I said we're going to do. Hey, yeah, we want to win a Super Bowl, but we're going to be consistent contenders. And they decided to go in another direction, and the team then goes to the Super Bowl the very next year. So that did hurt. That was bittersweet for me. But fortunately, I ended up on my feet in Indianapolis and ready to start another run with another group of guys.
And that run ultimately led you to winning the Super Bowl in 2007 as you became the first Black head coach to win the Super Bowl with the Colts. As you've had over a decade to reflect on that accomplishment, what does it mean to you that you were able to do that?
It meant a lot at the time, but I think it means even more looking back, looking at the history of our game and what happened, just the way it all played out. And to get to the Super Bowl that year, 2006 season, with Lovie Smith, with someone who came into the National Football League on my staff. And there had been 40 Super Bowls before that, never an African-American head coach. And all of a sudden we're there in Super Bowl 41, and it's 2 of us, and history was going to be made. At the time, you're just saying, hey, we got to win this game to be Super Bowl champions. But I knew it was going to be historical one way or another. And I was very proud at that moment. And I really felt like Lovie and I were representing so many coaches who didn't get the opportunity. So I felt like we were representing all of those guys, and it was a historic win.
Yeah, the Black community was gonna win, either way. But we're glad that you got the victory with it. Let's switch gears to the lack of diversity among the NFL head coaches. Over the last 4 years, there have been 27 head coaches hired in the NFL. 3 were Black. This year, there were some great coordinators, candidates passed over, including 3 of the 4 main coordinators in the Super Bowl: Eric Bieniemy, Todd Bowles, Byron Leftwich. In your opinion, Coach, why aren't these Black coaches, being given a chance to lead teams compared to their white counterparts?
Well, I really think, number one, I think a lot of owners don't know what they're looking for, and they don't know where to dig and where to find people. And then it's easy. It's easy to not look at everyone, because there's enough white coaches to go around that you're always going to be able to hire good coaches without looking under every stone and trying to dig. So you've got to be intentional if you want the best. And that's what I try to tell our ownership. Hey, there's nothing wrong with what we're doing, and you're always going to have good people. But are you going to have the best? Are you cheating your franchise, your players, your fans out of something because you don't really know? Bruce Arians is a good friend of mine, and he's talked about what a job Todd Bowles and Byron Leftwich have done. Byron Leftwich is one of these young, creative, innovative guys who everybody should be talking about. But for some reason, we tend to think, well, it's Bruce Arians or it's Tom Brady. And we've kind of discounted what Byron Leftwich has been able to do. Somehow we've got to get that out. I guess that's our job in the media to keep telling that story. But I think it's ownership who has to dig a little deeper and go below the surface and try to get the best people they can get.
And speaking about ownership, you wrote a heartfelt and powerful essay to the NFL owners about the responsibility in making sure the diversity is where it needs to be. What compelled you to write that letter at this time, and what did you want to get out of it?
You know, it kind of reminded me, I went back to 1993 when we had a really good team. There were a lot of openings, and I didn't get an interview. I saw the same thing happening with some of these outstanding coaches. Leslie Frazier had done a great job with Buffalo defense, and I wasn't hearing his name mentioned. And we talked about Bieniemy and Bowles and Leftwich, but there Pep Hamilton is another name. Pep Hamilton helped Andrew Luck become the Rookie of the Year as a quarterback in Indianapolis. Now he goes to the Chargers, and he helps Justin Herbert become Rookie of the Year as a quarterback. And all I hear is, well, we're looking for these young, innovative offensive guys, but there's no pipeline. There's nobody out there. And I said, wait a minute, what didn't this guy develop 2 Rookies of the Year? Unbelievably, that people are saying best quarterbacks to come up. Shouldn't somebody talk to Pep Hamilton? So I'm thinking about that, and just that's what made me reach out to the owners and say, hey, you guys have to do a better job. Are you really trying to tell us that you've done exhaustive searches in the last 3 years? You've had 20 new positions and only 2 African Americans. Are we really looking under every stone and crevice?
And did you receive any responses from the owners after you wrote that letter? And if so, what type of responses did you get from them?
I've gotten a lot of responses from people in football saying that was needed to be said, and assistant coaches and kind of general manager types, and people saying thank you. But I haven't gotten any response from any owners yet. So we'll see what happens.
Are you surprised by that, or?
Not really. I think that the response will come down the line, and hopefully it'll come with them in their thought process. We've got to get these owners and general managers to say, you know what? I have to do what's best. I've got to pick the best guy. And hopefully people can understand that we're not asking for quotas. Hey, hire 6 African-American coaches, hire 8 minority coaches. No, just make sure you're doing a thorough job, investigate everything, and pick the best person.
And you speak to these coaches, you have a great pulse or great understanding, of what the morale is like. So at this current time, what is the vibe that you're getting from, coaches in the NFL right now, Black coaches in the NFL right now?
There's a sense of discouragement right now, of disappointment. Guys saying, what has to be done? What do I have to do to get an opportunity just to get in the room and be interviewed and show people what I can do? And that's tough. We don't want to have that. We don't want guys to leave the system because they don't feel like there's going to be an opportunity. My son, Eric, is 29 years old, and he played college football. He played for Chip Kelly at Oregon, played in the kind of new wave offense. He's been around football his whole life. He had several people want to hire him. Jim Caldwell, when he was at Detroit, was going to hire him on the coaching staff. Chip Kelly offered him a job. And Eric said, no, I'd rather go in another line of work because I don't see the opportunities to advance. And, to me, that's a shame. If someone would sit there and say, this may not be the profession for me because there really isn't a chance to move up the ladder, we're going to lose some really quality minds if we're not careful.
The Fritz Pollard Alliance Executive Director Rod Graves said there needs to be some type of disruption in the current hiring process for coaches and GMs. What type of disruption do you feel like would be most effective to really get through to the owners?
I think probably the biggest thing that could happen is for players to say, you know what, we want to see some changes. When Philadelphia made their hire, I know a lot of the African-American players were upset that Deuce Staley didn't get more of a look. And they said after the fact, gosh, this was a shame. Well, what those players may have to do is go into the office before things happen. And, hey, we're making a change. Mr. Lurie, we want you to know how much we believe in Deuce Staley. And we need you to know we're going to be disappointed. If he doesn't get a legitimate shot at this job, we're going to be very disappointed. I don't know where that's going to go. It may affect our performance. It may affect whether we want to play here or not. Those will be the kind of things that owners will listen to.
What can people do, everyday citizens do right now, tangible change to help in, systemic racism and police brutality?
I've had a lot of people ask me that since the George Floyd situation. A lot of my white friends say, hey, I don't live in neighborhoods where we've got a lot of minorities. I'm not around, but I'm not racist. What can I do? And I always say, well, first of all, it starts with your family, right in your sphere. Talk with your family. This is how we're going to approach things. This is how we're going to interact with people. This is how we're going to treat people. That's got to be the starting point. And then where is your sphere of influence? And it doesn't matter how big that sphere is or how small it is. It may just be 2 people that you work with, or it may be your next door neighbor that you're good friends with. But having those conversations with them, and we've got to build this thing slowly from inside out. But if we can have those conversations first with our family and then with people we're close to, that's how it's going to mushroom out and make a difference across the country.
Yeah, I think it's very well said, and it's not a sprint, it's a marathon. But again, it's about that inner circle, first changing that, and then you can reach so many more people. Yeah. Coach Tony Dungy, thank you so much. I could listen to you talk for hours, but I don't want to hold you any longer. Thank you so much for joining us.
I appreciate it. Thanks for having me.